Thank you very much for this invitation to be with you virtually on this important day. And I applaud you for the theme that you have chosen, the Indigenous Epistemologies, because I think this is an area where you have great expertise, and bringing that into the methods of research allow us to look at an approach to research that is more responsive to the culture in your context in South Africa or other parts of Africa. I'm not sure if everyone is located in South Africa. I have worked throughout my career within the transformative approach to research, and I have become aware of the commonalities between a transformative lens and an Indigenous lens in research through my interactions with many Indigenous people, particularly Begele Chalisa in Botswana has been a person who has informed my thinking a great deal. And I've had the opportunity to visit many different countries and to see the implications of transformation of how we look at what makes good research when we put it into a framework that consciously addresses issues of justice. So let me introduce myself just a little bit. For some reason, I'm not advancing on my slide. There it is, okay. I was very kindly introduced and you were given my background. So I just wanted to make a couple of comments about it. As far as being a professor emeritus from Gallaudet, some of you may be aware that Gallaudet is a unique kind of university. It's a university that only serves the deaf and hard of hearing population. It's the only university of its kind in the world. And it was my conscious choice to go to that university because I have borne witness to inequalities on the basis of many different dimensions of diversity. In the United States, race is one that is very visible, and I witnessed the effects of discrimination on the basis of race when my family moved from Washington State to Kentucky. Washington State's in the Northwest and Kentucky's in the Southeast, and up to that point, I had actually never seen very many people of color. But when I moved to Kentucky, all of a sudden there were quite a few people of color, and I noticed that they did not live in my neighborhood, and they did not go to my school, and they did not go to my swimming pool. And so I asked my teachers why there were no Black people at my school. And the teacher just said, well, honey, they just prefer to be with their own kind. And I didn't know the words cognitive dissonance at that point, but I did know, I was in 7th grade, I did know there was something wrong with that picture, that it wouldn't just be a matter of affiliation that would keep people from living in conditions that would be a better quality of life, that there was something else going on, and that coincided with the time of the Civil Rights Movement in the United States. I hope you can hear me okay. If you can't, then please somebody let me know. There's someone doing yard work in the yard next to me. But the importance for me of having that experience where it really shifted my understanding, and I call that a transformative moment in my life, to say there's a basis where people are afforded a better quality of life, and it's not one that's earned, it's an unearned privilege. And so it took a while for me to figure out how that was going to influence my career path, but it was always something that was very important to me. And so when I had the opportunity, as I moved through my graduate school, I worked first in communities of high poverty. And then when I had the chance to work on policy research, I looked at issues around gender and around race and around disability. And at that point, I felt like there was something really missing in my understandings of how to do this research in ways that it would make a difference. I mean, I didn't want to just write reports and send them off to somebody and have nothing change. And so I looked around and I said, well, is there an opportunity for me to establish a relationship in a marginalized community so that I can learn better how we can work together for change? And the opportunity arose for me to be a professor, or at that time an assistant professor at Gallaudet University. And I thought, well, I'd never met a deaf person, so it clearly shows how marginalized they are. And maybe this was the right community for me to learn how to respectfully enter and learn how to work together. And I stayed with the university for over 30 years, and I'm very appreciative of all the learning that they afforded to me. I learned that I needed to shift my perspective on research, that what I'd been taught wasn't taking into account the issues of discrimination, excuse me, the issues of culture, or the issues of transformative change, and how as researchers we could be supportive of that. And so that is really where the transformative paradigm came from. And as I began to develop the idea that if you actually want to make a difference to people who are experiencing discrimination, who are being placed at risk, who are being marginalized, then you have to consciously incorporate that into the design of your work. And I was able to interact with members of a variety of different groups across the world to learn that they also were feeling this discontent with the way research was being approached. That they felt they were either not included, or if they were included, that it was not in ways that they felt was either representing them accurately or leading to changes that they really wanted to see in their communities. And it was from that then that the transformative paradigm became, for me, this kind of umbrella, which now, we talk about it in terms of intersectionality, that there are multiple dimensions of diversity that are used as a basis of discrimination. And some of those that I readily identified, race and ethnicity, disability, gender, sexual identity, deafness, socioeconomic status, religion, age. And as I worked with Indigenous communities, then I could see that tribal affiliation and status as an Indigenous person were also bases of marginalization and being used as a basis for discrimination. At the time when I was really working through how this approach to research would develop, I was seeing the commonalities with indigeneity, and it was through my encounters with Indigenous peoples that I saw that they had a different perspective, a slightly different perspective that was very important. And that not only could I learn from that to see how it informed work towards transformation, but I could see that there were things that I had not given consideration to that were of great importance to people who are Indigenous. So the goal in terms of a transformative paradigm is the provision of data, the engagement in processes through research that will lead to improved social, economic, and environmental justice. And I bring those three together because particularly in the international development communities, often the economic improvement is given priority, and the economic strategies that are used do not address social justice and do not address environmental justice. Just as one example, in work that I was doing in Indonesia, the international development said, well, these people are very poor, we need to address this, so let's put in a textile plant. But what was not considered were the social and environmental impacts of that textile plant, so that the people who worked there were not paid sufficiently for them to have a good quality of life. And the chemicals that were released from the textile plant led to the pollution of the river that the people used for their drinking, for their bathing, for their washing. And it led to increases in health-related threats. And so if we don't take those as a whole, the social, economic, and environmental justice, and we focus only on one aspect, then we leave people perhaps more vulnerable. And so then I said that, you know, my thinking was challenged by encounters with people who are Indigenous and through the literature that is emerging from the Indigenous scholarly communities. And from the Indigenous scholars, I came to see the importance of the interconnectedness of all of us, of the importance of relationships, and that interconnectedness meant that we needed to honor all those who came before us, all those who are here with us now, and all who will come in the future. You may recognize this as the concept of Ubuntu. And this was a concept that I had been unaware of until I was informed by people from Africa who taught me about the importance of giving consideration to this concept, that there were those who came before us. We could take action in the present, but we should do it with an eye towards how is that going to impact on the people in the future. And when we ask ourselves the question, how does that change how we approach research? I think it's a very profound question. In terms of goals, the Indigenous paradigm sees the importance of sovereignty, of decolonization, and of repatriation. So these would be goals that first I hadn't thought about inside the transformative paradigm, but when we ask people from an Indigenous culture, what are the goals that you have? In some of those communities, it's honoring their sovereignty, explicitly addressing decolonization, and repatriation when their lands had been taken away. So you see that there's some overlap, some commonality, but also some things that are distinctive in looking from an Indigenous point of view. So when we get to the concept of epistemology, I want to here contrast what I understood or what developed in terms of transformative epistemology with the Indigenous Relational epistemology. And the knowledge epistemology from the transformative point of view looks at knowledge as something that is constructed within a context of power, and that there are consequences attached to whose knowledge is given privilege. So if we think about what is considered to be knowledge, for example, in the United States, knowledge that Black people were inferior to white people was constructed within a context of power. When we critically analyze that, we see that the consequences of that lead to discrimination, less access to those resources and rights that every human being should have. And so then in the transformative epistemology, we're asked, how can our methods bring to light those that knowledge has been constructed within that context of power, and then challenge that understanding and value the knowledge that is given to us by those who have been marginalized. This leads to the need for close and collaborative relationships, that it's not possible for me to really gain trust, to understand how others are viewing the world, unless I can develop that kind of respectful relationship, one that is respectful within that cultural context. And also designing my research so that I'm explicitly looking at the power dynamics and how I can mediate those, so that I bring people who have more traditionally not been in a position of power in the research study in a way that then they can contribute from their experience, and that experience is given value, and that we continue to critically analyze how we can do that in an appropriate way. Now, my Indigenous colleagues, and I mentioned Begele Chalisa, also Fiona Cram from New Zealand, a Maori scholar, have both informed my understandings a great deal. And you can see that in the Indigenous Relational epistemology, the knowledge is considered to be subjective and objective, relational, and it includes spirituality and vision. Now, you didn't hear me talk about spirituality in the transformative, because from the framework that I had developed, spirituality had not come into it. But in working with my Indigenous colleagues and learning from them, I realized that this notion of spirituality is a part of who all of us are. We all have an aspect of spirituality that informs who we are. And when we look at interventions to create changes, and if we ignore that aspect of spirituality, then we're ignoring something that's very important, particularly within the Indigenous framework. That keeping indigenization as a central aspect in terms of epistemology, knowing that the community must play an essential role. So it's not as a secondary thought, but that the community must play an essential role from the very beginning, from the understandings, what are the problems that need to be addressed, what are methods that would be useful to address those, how can we collect data along the way so that we are informing in ways that are trustworthy and credible to members of that community. And the one thing that I think has been emphasized to me over and over again is that relationships are everything. That's really the core of the Indigenous Relational epistemology, and that also incorporates resistance to colonial or Western domination. So when research methods are brought in from the Western or Northern, the colonizing nations, there may be parts of that are found to be useful in an Indigenous framing for research, but there's resistance to acceptance of those in terms of dominating what the Indigenous community knows is appropriate within their cultural context. So that contrast there, I hope, allows you to see, again, some commonalities, but also some differences and some areas for growth and understanding of how to do research with relational epistemology. Okay, so I wanted also then to say that in my work, I go beyond the discussion of only epistemology to look also at the transformative and indigenous perspectives on axiology, or what makes research ethical, what's the nature of ethics, what are the values here, ontology, the nature of reality, and methodology, what are those systematic methods of inquiry that are compatible with the transformative and indigenous epistemologies, axiology, and ontology. So let's take a look at those. In terms of axiology and ethics, under the transformative paradigm, primarily there's a requirement for research to be ethical. It's to respect the cultural norms. Now, there's a tension in that because, first of all, you need to structure the research so that you can identify what the cultural norms and beliefs are. There's also a tension in that because some cultural norms sustain an oppressive status quo. So if we say that women are secondary citizens, or that violence against women is part of our cultural norms, then those are cultural norms that we need to challenge. And we do that on the basis of recognition by the community themselves that they don't want that to be the cultural norm, and cultural norms are not written in stone. It's not something that never changes. Because if I look just at the cultural norms around gender in the United States in my lifetime, the expectation for someone like me was to grow up and get married and have children. And my parents said, well, go to college because you might need to support yourself if something happens to your husband. Well, you know, that was the cultural norm of the day. Now the cultural norm is educate women. They should have employment that's appropriate to their skills and talents and desires to contribute, and that they should be able to go into an employment situation that is non-toxic, that's free of harassment. So those cultural norms have shifted in the United States just in my lifetime. That for our research to be ethical, we need to structure it so that it does provide that data and the process to promote the social, economic, and environmental justice that I referred to earlier. We also need to be cognizant of what are the inequities that are present within this context. What's the basis of discrimination, and it's contextually dependent. How do we bring that into the design of the study so that we can be supportive of transformative change? So there's an action orientation towards the understanding of what makes ethical research, that we look at the strengths within the community. When I've been in South Africa and I've been to the illegal squatter camps, and I've been to the inner cities in Johannesburg, and I've seen people living in conditions that are extremely difficult, and yet they're surviving. That takes strength. So how do we recognize that strength and bring that into the design of the study? And then in terms of reciprocity, an ethical study needs to give something back to the community. And when I was learning about research, sometimes we were advised to give a gift certificate to a fast food place, or books or toys. But what if instead of some material object, we give people the opportunity to learn how to be a part of that research process and how to use the outcomes of that to support the change that they see as necessary in their communities. That's the kind of reciprocity that needs to be built into the design of the study. Okay, so that was the ethical understanding that I had working from a transformative point of view. In the Indigenous perspective, in terms of ethics, the principles of relationality, which we saw was very important, respect, reverence, responsibility, reciprocity, reflexivity, responsiveness, and decolonization. So we see some overlap here, some commonality here, but we also see that importance of relationality, reverence, reflexivity, responsiveness, and decolonization. So together, these things can really help us understand better how to do the research that will create the change we're looking for. The importance of sustaining a healthy environment, that research needs to be conducted in a way that we support a healthy environment within the research study, but within the context that we are working, that we incorporate that concept of interconnectedness that we talked about earlier, the Ubuntu concept, that we understand the importance of spirituality within the Indigenous community. How is that practiced? How is that understood? What implications does that have in terms of our research methodology? That we look at how our research supports social justice and the equitable distribution of rewards, and that we consciously address inequities and discrimination. And so we see here that our ethical assumptions from transformative and Indigenous share characteristics. There's some uniqueness about the Indigenous perspective. There's some things that the transformative lens can certainly learn from the Indigenous, and that there's a compatibility between the epistemological assumptions and the ethical assumptions. Okay, if we look at ontology, the nature of reality from a transformative point of view, that it rejects cultural relativism. So there are many versions of reality, but all of them are not equal. Just as the one that I shared with you at the beginning of this about the historical view in the United States that Black people were less valued than white people, that was saying their version of reality. That version is not equal to the version of saying that all people have rights and everyone should have equal opportunity and equal access to resources. And so looking at where did those versions of reality come from, they come from different social positionalities. Who has the power to say, we're going to work from this version of reality versus we're going to work from this other version of reality, and looking at what are the consequences of privileging one version of reality over another. And so if we look at the various ways that we could implement a program, for example, HIV/AIDS prevention program, there might be a version of reality that comes about and says, well, the problem is the people just don't know what you can do to prevent the transmission of the disease. And so the intervention would be knowledge provision, or the people don't know the right way to eat to stay healthy. So the provision of knowledge about the food paradigm would be the way to intervene. But if we look at the version of reality from the people who are marginalized, the people who live in poverty, the people who have less power, and they say, but really, we know how to prevent the transmission of HIV/AIDS, but a lot of people are dying, and it's likely that I'm going to die too. So the intervention then becomes something that you need to address where the people are, that there's a very strong sense of sadness attached to that disease because you see people dying, you know people who have died, and you need to start with that emotional place and then build to an understanding that choices can be made, that people themselves, the students, the young people, women, have a choice in what they do. But then how do we give support so that those choices can be acted upon? Or in terms of the food pyramid, saying, okay, it's not just that they don't know what foods to eat, they don't have access to those foods. So how can we do that? Can we have community gardens? Can we have the provision and access to healthier forms of eating? That might require policy changes. So that's a different intervention because you understand that a version of reality has been put out there from a powerful position that isn't really going to be responsive to the needs in that community. In terms of the Indigenous perspective, realities are looked upon as being multiple, constructed, grounded in material, social, and spiritual contexts, and marked by that interconnectedness of living and non-living and relational existence. And so that gives us more nuances about the understanding of the nature of reality, that we need to look at how those realities are constructed and experienced from multiple perspectives and what the implications are in terms of understanding that we all are interconnected and that the work that we do needs to be reflective of that. All right, in terms of methodology, in terms of a transformative lens being brought to methodology, my argument generally is for the use of mixed methods, meaning both quantitative and qualitative data being collected within the same study, and the integration of the data that comes from quantitative and qualitative so that we come to a better understanding. The other aspect of the transformative methodology is that it's cyclical, meaning that we start with trying to understand who needs to be involved here and how can they be involved in ways that are respectful and that deliberately address those issues that were brought up earlier under epistemology, ontology, and axiology. How do we address those power relationships? How do we bring in people in respectful ways that give them an opportunity to contribute from their own experience, from their own understandings of what the nature of the problem is, that takes into account the cultural and contextual factors? And so my argument is that a transformative methodology requires that we have deliberate stages of building relationships, of understanding who needs to be there, and not just assuming that we know how to interact with people or imposing a certain framework because it's one that we've read about or we used before, but understanding how do you work together in ways that people feel safe and that they feel respected and valued, and that they can see that the contributions that they're making because of their lived experience within the culture and within that context are being taken into consideration. And that part of the methodology is also inclusive of understanding better the diversity within the context in terms of contextual factors, looking at the broader notion of contextual factors. What's the history here? What's the legislation that's important? What's the political structure? What's the economic structure? What's the access to health services, if that's relevant within the study that you're doing? But looking at what are the contextual factors as they stand at the moment of the beginning of the research, so that that can then be used to inform your understanding of what the nature of the problem is. So we don't go in with an assumption that we understand the nature of the problem, but we go in with an understanding that there is something that's been expressed as being problematic, but that we need to work through this process in order to understand how it's being experienced, and also understand better then what kind of intervention would be appropriate. In terms of the Indigenous methodological assumption, we look at it from the transformative participatory lens that brings in the mixing of Indigenous qualitative and quantitative methods and can be incorporated with Western quantitative and qualitative methods. But the Western quantitative and qualitative methods are not dominant. And so when we look at that mixing of Indigenous qualitative and quantitative methods, we can look at, for example, within particular tribal groups, there may already be group processes in place where problems are discussed in the community. How can the research respectfully enter into the process that's seen as valid as a part of the methodology within that community? But also asking critically, are there processes in place, but do those processes exclude certain groups of people? For example, women, or people with disabilities, or people who are deaf. How could then that process be expanded so that you can bring in the voices of those who are marginalized within the Indigenous communities? And how can you incorporate Western quantitative and qualitative methods without violating the Indigenous qualitative and quantitative methods, so that the Indigenous qualitative and quantitative methods are viewed as those that dictate the modifications that are needed in Western quantitative and qualitative methods, so that the research can be done in a way that's responsive to the Indigenous community and that's supportive of the kind of change that they would like to see. So the reason that I am so convinced that these paradigmatic borders between transformative and Indigenous, and maybe even other paradigms, the post-positivist and the constructivist and the pragmatic, are porous, is because of my engagement with members of Indigenous communities with whom I've had extensive conversations. We've done writing together. Begela Chalisa and I will have an article coming out in the American Journal of Evaluation. It will be out sometime this year. And it is about the epistemic violence that's created when international development agencies dismiss Indigenous frameworks in terms of the research that supports the understanding of problems and the type of interventions that are appropriate. And that within the Indigenous focus, the paradigm, the lens, it's possible to bring some elements of the transformative in, as long as they're done so in a way that's respectful. And Fiona Cram, who you might, if you're seeing the picture, Begela is the person next to me in the first picture. In the second picture, we have two Māori scholars on the left side of the picture. And the second one is Fiona Cram. She and I have written several articles and chapters that have appeared in different journals and handbooks about what it means when you bring an Indigenous perspective and a transformative perspective together. And so that's what gives me this confidence to say, not only can we learn from each other, but we can integrate aspects of each other's understandings of what it means to value knowledge, to interact with each other, to build relationships, to work towards change, and that there's benefit in doing that. By the way, the crew that you see in the right-hand picture are many of the contributors to the Indigenous Pathways book, and that we ask in that book, we ask Indigenous researchers and evaluators how they move forward in their careers in terms of being researchers and evaluators. And in many of their narratives, they said that their initial introduction to research dismissed their knowledge and values as Indigenous people, and that it was only through sort of a pathway that was nonlinear, that was circuitous and maybe turned back on itself, that they came to understand what it meant to bring the Indigenous perspective in. And so I am very, very grateful that we have this openness to be able to discuss how we can learn from each other and how we can improve what we're doing, because we do cross those borders. Okay, so looking at in the article that I was mentioning to you that will come out in the American Journal of Evaluation, Begela Chalisa is first author, I'm second author, and the example in there comes from the Made in Africa literature, of which you may be aware came out of work with international development organizations that said, well, let's see, if we do want to bring an African perspective, or we want it to be situated, rooted in an African context, what does that mean? And what I have on this slide are the main principles that were identified in the Made in Africa literature, that the research needs to be contextually relevant and relational. So this is something that we've talked about. What is it within that context that's relevant? And I would argue that understanding the power dynamics, understanding the history, understanding the basis of discrimination and marginalization, and understanding how to build relationships that are respectful and that critically analyze those power relationships that might either lead to transformative change or to sustaining oppressive status quo is a part of that Made in Africa approach to research, and that it also incorporates that concept of Ubuntu. I raised this question earlier. What difference would it make in the design of our research if we sat down and said we must be responsible to everyone who came before us, everyone who is here with us now, and everyone who will come after us, and not talking only about human beings and other living creatures, but all creatures, all the sea, the air, the earth, the trees, everything is interconnected. So what difference does that make in terms of the design of our work? That it also be conducted under the principle of African self-determination, so that the people from Africa are the people who are in the positions of power to say, this is what the research should be looking like. It's not to say that there can't be partnerships, there can't be room for a Western researcher to work with African researchers. I have engaged in that myself, and I have felt that it's been very beneficial for me to be a learning person, and also to have the opportunity to challenge and to contribute ideas. But the dominance is African self-determination. That it's inclusive of spirituality and Indigenous knowledge. So again, the prioritization being given, what are the values that are included in this work, in the research? How do we incorporate the values of spirituality? How do we incorporate Indigenous knowledge? That it's okay to mix the Indigenous and Western knowledge, but giving dominance to the Indigenous knowledge. And that we include those aspects of ethics that we talked about, axiological assumption under an Indigenous paradigm, we consciously build into our design relationality, how we build relationships, incorporating respectful relationships, responsibility, that we take seriously our responsibility as researchers to work with communities, reverence, reciprocity, giving back, respectful representation, reflexivity, rights and regulations, and decolonization. So from the Made in Africa perspective, we're talking about the design of research that reflects the Indigenous epistemology, Indigenous axiology, Indigenous ontology, Indigenous methodology, and that there can be porous borders with mixing Indigenous and Western knowledge, but it's African self-determination that is most important. Okay, so when I look at Indigenous and transformative, and I say, well, Made in Africa makes a very strong statement. Where's the overlap with that in terms of transformative? And is there added value by looking at a transformative lens? What could that add? And I think the overlap is clearly in terms of the cultural responsiveness, that is a part of both transformative and Indigenous. It's at the core, at the beginning, to understand how we relate to people, how we build trust. And I will say that my consciousness was raised through my work with Indigenous people to understand better the meaning of building trusting relationships and with the full range of stakeholders. So not just as traditionally in some research studies in the West, it's like, okay, you look at those in power who funded you, who's the director of the program, and that those are the people that you work with and you interact with, but building that trusting relationship across the full range of stakeholders, who's included, who's not included, what are the reasons people are not included, how can they be included respectfully, and that brings us to that consciously addressing power differentials and challenging those oppressive versions of reality. So collecting data through the study that says, okay, so some people say this is the problem, some people say that's the problem. What's the basis? Where's the data that support the nature of the problem? Where does it come from? What are the consequences of saying, oh, it's okay, we just need to teach people knowledge, versus saying we need to start with where people are, with their understanding of the phenomena, whether it's HIV/AIDS transmission, healthy eating, access to health care, access to quality education. All of those versions of reality can either sustain oppression or they can lead to transformative change. And we have a responsibility to make visible those versions of reality that can lead to transformative change. I think the transformative paradigm emphasizes and brings to more attention the concept of heterogeneity and intersectionality. And part of my understanding of the importance of this comes from my work in the deaf community, which I told you about was something that was very formative for me as a researcher to understand the experiences. And I'm not deaf, as my students always said, you're not deaf yet, Dr. Mertens. That the deaf community is very heterogeneous, that it's not even a case that you're deaf, you're deaf, you're deaf, but some people are deaf and use sign language. Some people are deaf and use assistive listening devices. Some people are deaf and read lips, and there's different sign languages across the globe. And so thinking even only in terms of the characteristic of deafness, there's a great deal of heterogeneity. But within the deaf community, there are people who identify with all categories of sexual identity. So you have people who are heterosexual, male, female. You have people who are transsexual, people who are gay, lesbian, people who are questioning their identity. All of those come also into the deaf community. And so what difference does it make if we look at it as a homogeneous group, deaf, versus saying what are the characteristics that are contextually relevant here? And we also have people of all different races and ethnicities, with home languages, with religion, with age, all of those characteristics that in some contexts are used as a basis of discrimination are present within the deaf community. And so understanding within that context what is important. I think that's a big contribution from Transformative. And the final contribution, I believe, is the supporting of transformative action to increase social, economic, and environmental justice. I think this does connect with the Indigenous understanding of interconnect. But for me, parsing it out as social, economic, and environmental justice allows us to give critical examination, particularly in international development contexts where economic development seems to take precedence over social and environmental justice, and it results in a less just world, a less healthy world, particularly for those who are most marginalized. Okay, so I said that I devoted my life to this, and these are just a few of the books that I've written that have articulated the kinds of things that we've been talking about. I've also included a slide of references, including the new journal article that will be coming out in the American Journal of Evaluation, the Chenard and Cram book just published on culturally responsive approaches to evaluation, in which they have divided culturally responsive into Indigenous, Western, and international development. So it's a very interesting book. I hope that these slides are made available to you so that you can have access to these references. And then I share with you my contact information, because I believe that it really does take all of us working together to see the social, economic, and environmental justice in the world, to see the transformations that are needed, to be supportive from the role that we can as researchers. And so if you're doing this kind of research, you want to share it with me. If you meet challenges, just send me an email, because it does really take all of us. Okay, so that is the end of my formal presentation.